Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, e no rangatira mā, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai, ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coates aho, ko te kaiahi o te putea whaiwhakaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening, warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates, I'm CEO of Mindful Money. We're a charity that aims to make money a force for good, as well as providing radical transparency for KiwiSaver and investment funds through our website. We undertake these kind of seminars to kind of basically talk about how investment can make a difference on issues that matter. Tonight, we're talking about the conflict in Russia, the Russian conflict in Ukraine rather, and I think for all of us, there's no issue that matters more than that at the moment. This is the 12th seminar in the series. You can see all the recordings on our website on climate change, net zero commitments, social housing, impact investing, and investor engagement last week. Our panel tonight will have a discussion for about 30 minutes and we'll then open up for questions, but you can use the Q&A function at any stage during the seminar to put your question in and that will help us answer them. Tonight, as I said, we're talking about the conflict in Ukraine, the invasion by Putin's regime into Ukraine. This is an issue for which there is kind of massive outrage internationally over the death of civilians, the suffering, and the illegality of the action of the Putin regime. So we want to delve into this issue not so much from direct intervention, but actually about what we can do from a New Zealand base, and particularly through the use of finance. So with that, I want to start by introducing our panel, and I'll introduce them one at a time and then give them a chance to introduce themselves, a little bit about their take on the issue. First, John Beattie. John is CEO and a term I hadn't come across before, resident wayfinder at Pathfinder Asset Management. John believes ethical investing can fund a better and fairer world. For over a decade, he's embedded this belief in a series of innovative ethical funds. Pathfinder's work is award-winning, Social Impactor of the Year from the Sustainable Business Network, Responsible Investment Manager of the Year from Research IP, and the most important of all, in my humble opinion, Best Ethical KiwiSaver Fund at the last Mindful Money Awards last year. So, John, very warm welcome.
Kia ora, Barry, and hello to everyone.
So, John, can you just illuminate a little bit about the background to Pathfinder on Russian investment and what kind of actions Pathfinder has taken?
Sure. Just very quickly, Barry, we're a active manager and we handpick the stocks we invest in using both ESG metrics and ethical and values-based overlays. So our portfolio is maybe 250 companies in our KiwiSaver, which is very small as opposed to thousands and thousands of companies for a lot of KiwiSavers. So we can be very focused about where we're invested in terms of industries, in terms of companies, and in terms of countries. And for us in the ESG space, and I'm sure we'll unpack this a bit later on, but for us in the ESG space, the governance relates not just, the G factor governance relates not just to a company itself and the level of governance that company has, but also the system it operates under, which is the country, the transparency, the fairness within the country itself. So, we weren't invested in Russia, in Russian government bonds, Russian companies. We haven't been invested in there.
Cool. Thank you, John. And we'll come back to those issues, as you say. We have a fantastic audience here tonight, including many learned people, experienced people from the finance sector. So you'll be very aware of the terminology, but for those who aren't, there'll be a lot of talk about ESG tonight, environment, social and governance issues. And typically, this is a framework of analysis of the impact of these factors on financial risk of the companies. And it's perhaps the main tool which is used in the financial management industry to take account of the external environment. So without further ado, I would like to introduce David Beattie. David's been on a number of our seminars before, but not for some time. So welcome back, David. David's had over 35 years of investment management and portfolio research. He joined Booster in 2000 as Chief Investment Officer. He's now moved into the role of Principal at Booster with focus on strategy, investment stewardship, and financial advisor relationships. He also chairs Booster's Investment Committee. So a warm welcome to you, David. And if you want to give us the same kind of snapshot of sort of investment in Russia from Booster's perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Barry, and kia ora, everybody. Hope you're having a good night tonight. It's a little unusual to be trying to talk about money in the middle of the appalling situation that's going on with Russia's senseless attack on the Ukraine. And I think it's important just to state up front that all of us stand firmly in support of the people of Ukraine. So just from an investment perspective, we've always followed a philosophy of combining actively managed, directly held investment strategies around some more passive core index funds and strategies to extract what we believe are the key benefits of both approaches. We currently have about $5 billion of investments in total, and around 3.5 of that is in one of our 15 multi-sector KiwiSaver funds which we offer. Just useful to know, I guess we've been involved in the SRI space for quite a number of years, and we were the first New Zealand fund manager to have our SRI funds certified by the Responsible Investment Association. And we do apply our own in-house ESG assessment process across all of the companies that we directly hold in our funds. At the time of the Russian attack on the Ukraine, we held no Russian investments directly in our funds. And we are currently now in the process of getting rid of the very small holdings in Russian investments, which we've held indirectly through 2 Vanguard index funds. It's good to hear that Vanguard have actually now committed to this divestment process, and they've confirmed that this is going to be completed with urgency and as soon as practicable, depending a whole lot on how the markets open, I guess. I'll talk a little bit more about the sort of the index fund component to the mix of active versus passive. So provide some interesting and useful insights into how that works currently and how I think this event is potentially going to change the dynamic of how that works in the future quite significantly.
Great, thank you, David. And that will be one of the issues that we come to as a panel, because I think it's a key issue that's been illuminated in responding to this crisis. So let me turn to our final panelist, Tanya Gilchrist. Very warm welcome, Tanya. Tanya's been an investment advisor since 2003 with a special interest in responsible investing. Finding out what's important to her clients on their investing journey is the start of the process, followed by incorporating those values and goals into their investments. Tanya helps her clients make informed decisions that can create positive impacts for people on the planet. She's a member of the Decision Makers Cooperative Group since 2009, and she's also a member of the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. So very warm welcome, Tanya.
Thank you, Barry. It's an honour to be here tonight, surrounded by people who really value what's going on and trying to make a difference in the world.
Cool. Can you talk a little bit about the issues of Russia and that you've come across over the past weeks as a financial advisor?
Yeah, so part of what we do as advisors is try and find out what people value and try and invest their money in the values in a way that they will be okay with knowing where their money's gone. And over the last few weeks, I guess it's meant that some clients maybe weren't sure whether or not we knew that war was something they weren't really interested in. So we've been fielding some calls from people about, do I have any investments in Russia? If so, how much? And just really wanting to know that we were being proactive about making sure that they weren't involved in any way with the way that they were investing.
Okay, thank you. And again, we'll come back to those issues, and particularly kind of the public reaction to these issues. I think it's really illuminating. So let's bring everyone back on the panel, and I want to kick off with the issue that you raised, David, about active versus passive investing. So Mindful Money has, as people probably know, has data on the portfolios of all the KiwiSaver and investment funds. We not only track the direct investments, but also the indirect investments through funds, passive funds or index funds within the portfolios. And what we've seen since the start of the crisis is that many funds weren't invested at all, as John pointed out for Pathfinder, a number of others as well. Some divested early in the process, but relatively few, and most of them divested after the invasion of Ukraine. And there was a cost to doing that, a financial cost, as well as I think somewhat of a reputational cost. And that financial cost was a loss of somewhere between 80 or 90% of the value of the investment in the past week. The kind of the talking point for this issue is virtually all of the funds that haven't been able to divest so far are passive funds, are the ones that hold their investments in primarily index funds. And it has become very obvious in watching this, and all the information is available on our website, that you see the active fund managers are able to respond to public opinion, but it's much harder for the passive funds to do that. David, can you describe that a little bit from the perspective of a manager who has investments in passive funds?
Yeah, so as I said, we have a combination of active and passive, and there's no doubt that having total control on the active side is a very powerful thing to have. And you're right, it's the index passive bit that you lose control of directly. And for sort of small to medium-sized KiwiSaver fund managers, or any managers who typically use a third-party index fund for some or all of their multi-sector portfolio investments, index funds becoming increasingly problematic, particularly when serious situations like this arise. So they provide a very good cost-effective way to get instant broad diversification across a range of key asset classes, countries and individual securities, but they are typically all or nothing. So even if you wanted to, you could not in advance proactively buy, say, an emerging market index fund ex Russia. They don't exist. So it's all or nothing. And then holding them, if you just simply sell an emerging markets index fund completely, not only do you remove the entire and significant portfolio diversifying asset class that you want to have in your portfolio, but you're also at that time effectively pulling support from all of the 27 countries that are in the index, including, for example, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. So this ends up being a very sort of blunt response with potentially significant and negative unintended consequences. So we prefer the approach where you sit down with a passive manager and just talk to them through some of the issues. And I've just sort of made a bit of a note here about how that's worked in practice, if you just allow me to go through. 4 years ago, for example, we committed a lot of time helping Vanguard to establish their ethically conscious global bond index fund. And at the time, there was a very significant step forward for ESG investing by helping to create this globally diversified bond fund that excluded companies involved in fossil fuels and weapons, amongst a whole lot of other standard exclusions. But in the end, we had to accept a limit on the screening that MSCI and Vanguard were prepared to undertake. So the screening process on controversies was limited to non-government securities only, and they did not include government securities. It was interesting, just as an aside, that fund was only made available to Australian and New Zealand investors. I'm presuming because there was little demand for it in the United States. That raises a whole other issue again, which we may not have time to talk about. But one of the, I think, many challenges for index fund managers going forward is for them to be less focused on tracking error issues, which we find constantly keeps coming up, and the mechanics of that. And they need to be far more focused on what the end investor values are. And this would obviously enable some more proactive, effective and productive discussions to quickly deal with any clearly evolving controversial securities, rather than continuing to allow it to be a rather torturous and reactive change process that we've experienced to date. Yeah. And I can say with confidence that if the MSCI and Bloomberg had not removed the Russian bonds from their indices, we would have potentially been spending weeks and or months dealing with this issue just to try and get rid of it. This is an area that we're going to be now aggressively pursuing with Vanguard to include sovereign bonds in their controversy screening process. And it'll be interesting to see what sort of response they give to us on that, to see if they can get their heads around this mindset shift from the mechanics and technical portfolio construction of an index tracking fund with a whole lot of PhD people through to looking after the end users.
So just for the audience, when David is talking about controversies, it's not only international conflicts, it's also things like human rights violations and undertaken by a company, and the question is how responsive is a passive fund to be able to remove a company from the index where the company behaves badly or has systemic human rights violations or environmental damage or other issues. John, can I pass to you and just say, do you think an issue like this conflict is going to change the way people think about the balance of active and passive investments? Because for so long the message has been, oh well, you can kind of almost get everything that you want on responsible investment standards through a passive fund, and you can do it a whole lot cheaper. So do you think this experience will change people's understanding of that trade-off at all, or?
Yeah, look, it could have an impact, Barry. And like if we think of investing, ethical investing or responsible investing in New Zealand, 2016 was a big moment when people understood they had nukes and landmines and controversial weapons in their KiwiSaver. More recently, there's been a lot of awareness around climate change, and it might be, Jacinda Ardern saying, that climate is the nuclear moment for a generation. It might have been the default providers having to have exclusions around fossil fuels, but climate change has had that awareness, and I think this could raise awareness around what's in a portfolio, what's not in a portfolio, and control of it. But essentially, there is no right answer in terms of constructing a portfolio, whether you use an active or a passive approach. There is no right answer, and it's really what is right for an individual investor. And so the trade-off with passive, like David is saying, you can't control what's in there. You take the index or you don't take the index, but you get it cheaply. And so that's your trade-off. And for some investors, that may be fine. For other investors who want a really targeted approach, I've seen passive indexes that have ESG or environmental, social and governance metrics used in the process. So passive ETF investments that have Raytheon, that have ExxonMobil. There's a sustainability index in the UK that has tobacco companies in it. So you get some pretty unusual answers sometimes, but they're following the rules of the individual index. So hopefully this raises investor awareness, but ultimately investors need choice and they need to choose what's appropriate for them and balancing cost and values and the investment approach they want.
Tanya, as a financial advisor, you're primarily where you are sort of helping people make investments in actively managed funds. But do you often find that people will be asking you about, isn't there a cheaper option to go into a passive fund? Do people weigh up the trade-offs on cost, or at the stage that they're coming to see you, are they generally convinced that they want a more actively managed solution?
We do tend to find that because I guess by the time that people decide they want an advisor, they're not necessarily wanting to do it themselves. I think a lot of people who go into the index funds think I can do this myself and it'll be really cheap and I can just put my money wherever it's going. Don't tend to find that they're turning up at our door. I would say, though, that a lot of people don't even think about where their money's going until we have the conversation. So I think an important part of an advisor's role is to actually just start a conversation. Say, would you be happy if your money went here or if your money went there? And when they start to understand that their money is actually supporting something along the way, then it's a lot easier conversation to have.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So I want us to move on to a second topic for us to consider as a panel. A number of the funds that were initially invested in Russian companies aligned to the Putin regime or directly in Russian government bonds were funds that claimed to have a strong responsible investment policy and to manage their portfolio using ESG management, so environment, social governance management. And internationally, there's been a lot of criticism over recent months about failures of ESG to, in a way, take ethical issues into account and allegations of a lot of greenwashing around ESG claims. Given the fact that a lot of funds who did talk about ESG management didn't divest from Russia at an early stage or invested at all, what does that say to you about the failings of the ESG system? Is it a case of inadequate analysis and not applying it to international conflicts? Is it a case of misleading claims? Is it a case of just not carrying the analysis through into portfolio construction? What are your views on what's happened with in this case with ESG management? And John, I'll come to you first.
Thanks, Barry. Look, I'm a big fan of ESG investing, using environmental, social and governance factors in the stock selection. And I suppose that the challenge is there's no single definition of what ESG means. So for some people, they will look at a company, they'll look at it on financial metrics, and then they'll run an ESG screen and see there's nothing particularly offensive about it. And they'll use it essentially as a measure of quality or a measure to try and help improve financial returns within a stock. So if you think of climate change, for example, if you're analysing a company with the E factor, environment, you want to know that it has a transition plan to a low carbon world. If it doesn't, it's a higher risk investment in the long term. So that's kind of how ESG can be used. ESG for me goes further than that it actually has, when you're talking about environmental and social issues, you're talking about values as well. So for me personally, it has a values overlay. And I think that's where the failing has been is for some managers, it's purely to help me find better financial investments without overlaying some values on top of it and common sense values on top. And you know, like I mentioned at the start, Barry, just the governance factor, there is quite a bit of debate about, is the governance just about the company itself, or is the governance, do you look at the wider system that it operates in, like the country that it operates in?
Yeah. And Tanya, coming to you, do you see a lot of people concerned about misleading claims about responsible investing in ESG? Do people kind of know what the terms mean, know who's saying stuff that's real and who's making claims that aren't substantiated?
I don't think they come to me knowing who's making claims that aren't substantiated, but they do know what decarbonisation and things like those types of words mean. I guess it's the working out of it and what each company is doing towards it, but also what countries are doing. And I think what John said about company and country, they both have to work together. And if you're in a system that doesn't encourage it, and the company's in a country that doesn't encourage it, there is you have to wonder where the level of I guess what they're holding themselves accountable to, because accountability and transparency is so important in what they're actually communicating, and is what they're communicating actually happening? Yeah. It's very hard to know that if you're not on the ground, but that's what we trust the fund managers to know. And as advisors, we feel like the in-between, we trust that the fund managers are actually doing their job to know whether or not these companies they're investing in are actually doing what they say they're doing. And we can ask as many questions as we like, and investing is always a journey. But it's always refreshing to hear someone say, hey, we made a mistake, but we're not going to make it again, and we've fixed it, and this is what we've learned from it. So as much as I'd love to say that everyone, I think a lot of people have the right intention. It's just about following it through and making sure that you're continuing on and keeping people accountable, really.
Thank you. Yeah, good. And John, David, to you, the issue you referred to earlier on about governance not including conflict and its definition sometimes, and maybe ESG sort of perspectives are too narrow. I guess it's kind of hard to believe that investment managers would miss something like an invasion of a neighbouring country and the kind of impacts that have been caused from that, and not relate that to their investment funds.
Yeah, look, I think the comments are right. Some of the focus has been a little narrow, and I think positively the ESG movement is working and heading in the right direction. And I think actually New Zealanders are better served by the managers and the sort of products and choices that are available to them here. I alluded to the ethically conscious bond fund, which was launched here in Australasia, that hasn't got any traction anywhere else in the world. And that's something that we pushed hard for as New Zealanders, as we've pushed hard for exclusion of nuclear weapons and military style armaments and all those sorts of things in response to what was going on around us. And that momentum is not happening overseas. And when you're sitting in New Zealand reliant as a passive manager, say, on some component of your portfolio in products that are globally sourced, and you come up against barriers to get those things done, it's a little frustrating. We do have all the right intentions, and we are heading in the right direction. But I think in the case of Russia, the global index providers have missed a trick, because they themselves kept the G definition too narrow as well. And I just reread through the Vanguard Ethically Conscious Bond Fund offer document just before I came on here, just to check what wordings did they have in there, and they explicitly exclude a screen on government securities. And that is going to change significantly. And I think this attack on Ukraine is going to be a watershed moment for the whole active versus passive debate. And I don't think it necessarily comes down to that, but from my perspective, I think how index funds react to this from this point on is going to define a point in time where we may even have reached peak passive. Because if they don't respond appropriately and start listening to investors, they're going to find there's going to be a mass exodus of funds out of their index funds into directly held, individually managed accounts where the people like ourselves, who are the guardians of people's money, can have total control over what we do. And we're no longer happy to sit back and be dependent on their decision-making processes, which are slow, reactionary, and ill-focused.
That's a great warning to index funds to up their game, I think, David. So thank you for that.
I've fired my first shot at them right now. I hope they're tuned in and listening.
Exactly.
Are you there, Vanguard?
Yeah. I'll add a sort of mindful money postscript to all of this, that actually one of the ways to find out whether funds are serious about taking ESG into their portfolios is to look at their portfolio on mindful money, because you can see the companies that they invest in on a look-through basis, and that does tell you kind of which companies are in the investment portfolio, and ultimately that's part of the objective truth of whether or not ESG analysis is being applied. They may be engaging with companies to improve their performance, but they should be talking about that and should be talking about how they are improving that performance in their reporting as well. So let's move on to the third area. And the third area is kind of sometimes quite tricky, but I want to talk a little bit about so what's happened with New Zealand investment is that we have pulled money out of investments in Russian companies, particularly those aligned to Putin's regime, and pulled money out of Russian government bonds. And the question we sometimes get challenged on is, does this kind of divestment really make any difference? And so who wants to pick up on that one? David, let's take you first.
Well, I could probably just, John, you're bursting to say something. Do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you, David. Thank you, Barry. Look, what I was going to say is if you think about exclusions, which is the basic form of responsible investing, so don't invest in tobacco companies, don't invest in alcohol, that actually won't change the world in a hurry. Makes us feel better about our conscience. It won't change the world in a hurry. It does put pressure on those companies because it makes them feel, I don't know, a bit dirty or they're being excluded from all the sustainability portfolios, and so there is pressure on them, but it's slow pressure. I think this is different. Because if we look at how the world's responded, normally you would have just government sanctions. So you'd have expel an ambassador, freeze some assets, put on some tariffs. But what we're seeing here is much, much broader. And we're seeing companies like Nike and Apple and car manufacturers and banks, even big oil, pulling out of Russia, pulling their assets out of Russia. We're seeing payment systems, part of the global plumbing of finance, like the SWIFT payment system, not allowing Russian banks to settle through it. It's amazing how far-reaching this is, these economic sanctions are. And what investors are doing by pulling out is just on top of that. And on one hand, you could say that act in itself is not material, but you combine it together with all the other actions going on, all the investors pulling their money out. Yes, it helps me sleep better at night knowing I'm not part of funding a regime that is just behaving so diabolically, but there is pressure going on by the world just shunning investment in Russia.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, no, John, you're totally right. It's somewhat useful to make some sort of distinction, and it also helps people to feel a little better when they realise that an existing investment is not actually funding anything at the moment, because it's just being bought on the secondary market, and all it's reflecting is the price of that investment is going up or down to reflect demand and supply. Where the financing happens is in the next round. So either the Russian government want to issue more bonds, for example, or a bond matures and then it has to be replaced with another investment. And so that's when you're getting into the funding side. And that for me is going to be one of the many very interesting developments at a time down the track. I don't know how long. We're talking quite a number of months, probably before the MSCI feel comfortable to even think about reopening that box. And then what will happen when they reopen the box and want to think about, and Russia's going to be pleading to get back in to the indexes, because that's where the next funding is coming from. And I'm hoping that our collective small contribution to this is that we put a big hand up and go, I'm sorry, but we as investors are no longer financing that. So Russia's going to have a big problem at that point. And so hopefully
Tanya?
we can all collectively send that.
Yep. Tanya?
Yeah. I think it's going to be a long time before my clients would ever even think about wanting fund managers to put any money near Russia. But I think the bigger question is what's next, because we know this isn't the only war that's ever going to happen. And I guess it's staying on top of what's coming next as well. So all the sanctions are really great. They seem to be doing their job, especially the SWIFT payment system, from what I understand, that's making quite the impact. And it's great that we can all do that. But I guess after this, what have we learnt from it too? What are we going to take away from this? I think it's a better conversation to have with people who are trying to save for their retirement, people who are retired, about, what do you really value and how are your values reflected in your investments?
Yeah, really good. That's great. I'm going to take facilitator's prerogative and just make two comments. One, I don't really agree with the arguments about divestment being powerless, because if an individual divests, then somebody else buys his shares. If enough people do it, and if it's accompanied by strategies to delegitimize the country or the company, then actually it can have a massive effect. And it's had a massive effect on slavery in the old days, on during the apartheid regime. It's had a massive effect on fossil fuel funding. And you only have to ask the oil companies, as many people have done, how difficult it is for them to get capital. Even on the secondary markets these days, their share price has suffered as a result of their cost of capital has gone up. And the same things happen to Russia. Look at the prices of the share prices of Russian companies at the moment. They are kind of maybe 5 or 10%. Divestment does have a massive impact if it's done at scale, and if it's done in a coordinated way, accompanied by ways to delegitimize the country or the company. And I think we need to kind of make sure that we keep up to date on understanding the issues about divestment, because I think there's a natural kind of reversion to saying, oh yes, well, divestment doesn't matter. Actually, there's lots of research around to say that done at scale, it really does. And the other thing that I think is worth saying is, you started off, John, governments have put in sanctions, but actually business, the finance sector and citizens have gone way beyond the sanctions with the measures that they've put in place on Russia. And I think we're going to look back and say, actually, this is a time at which companies trying to keep their stakeholders' interests at heart actually are moving in ways that they would never have moved before. And the whole idea of the stakeholder economy, I think, has actually been shown to be active, and I think this is really a time where the combined power of business, finance, and citizens is actually changing the ground rules around and going far beyond government sanctions. I mean, New Zealanders have acted well before the government's bill on sanctions, which is going through this week. So I think there are some really important implications from this. Can we move on to sort of a final question, which is how do you see this playing out as hopefully Putin's regime will come under pressure, and hopefully there will be an opposition that will force regime change in Russia. Hopefully it will happen early enough for the people of Ukraine. What how do you see this this playing out, and where do you think you alluded to kind of will investment go back in, but what are the implications of this in the longer term? Tanya, let me start off.
I assume, Barry, you're asking from an investment perspective, because putting that to one side and then start looking at how could this play out. There's a scary range of scenarios because the world is dealing with someone who's not rational or, dare I say, sane, and he is well protected. And if he gets boxed into a corner, who the hell knows what he's capable of doing? So that itself is a bit of a scary proposition, and I'm not sure, that in some extent is going to override some of our investment decision making when the indirect small amount of Russian investments made up 0.2% of the portfolio. It's the other 99.8% that potentially is going to be under significant volatile circumstances and uncertainty over the next few months. I was just chatting tonight before I came, and I think there's the real resolution to this non-investment side is actually going to have to come from the Russian military and some sort of internal civil war, because the rest of the world is just obviously taking a step back because they recognise just how volatile and unhinged Putin is and what he's capable of if you start pushing him too far too fast. So our fingers are crossed in a way that perhaps internally this might be resolved as the Russian army perhaps is finally sort of got to, from the messaging and the narrative in their heads has changed sufficiently for them to realise, hey, we've been sold down the river on this, and that's where it might start. From an investment perspective, I think Russia's going to be very significantly affected on an ongoing basis, if not permanently.
Okay, thank you. Tanya?
Yeah. I agree with David. I think it has to happen internally. They have to, with all the information that we have on the internet now, and I know they've blocked social media and things, but the Russians themselves actually have to make the decision that this isn't what they want for their country. They don't want to be known for this globally, and they have to make a stand. That, I think, is the best option coming out of this. It's when you're dealing with someone who's, for all intents and purposes, not completely right in the head, then the level of unpredictability is extreme. And we've had a volatile time of it already during COVID and everything that's done to the planet. And this is really bad timing more than anything. And
Yeah. John?
Yeah.
Not much to add. Look, I agree with what's been said. I suppose I'll just make some comments about the financial side and the investment side. And it seems, our conversation today has been focused on ethics and values, and it seems a bit trivialising it to talk about money. But, we're managing people's money. We have to manage it effectively. So what does it mean? Russia, JP Morgan are saying that for the current quarter, for the current 3 months, their GDP will be down 30%. I mean, that's a massive hit to the economy. For Europe, huge amounts of their oil and gas, about a quarter of their oil, more than that of gas, come from Russia. What we will see there is investment in renewables and more spending on renewables. That's not immediate, that's over a medium term, but more money into solar and wind. China's kind of stepped back and is sitting back and watching, but with the inflation going on, food inflation, oil inflation will really concern China at some point. Yeah. I hope they step in and encourage a ceasefire or broker a solution. They're not doing that at the moment, but this is not in their interests or anyone's interests for this situation to really blow up a lot more. From a global economic perspective, this will slow growth. And it's pushing up energy and food inflation, which is super unhelpful. So from an investment perspective, I would say this is an environment for active management, being selective, choosing resilient companies, choosing companies with strong balance sheets and good cash flow. And we'd also say that using, we talk about ESG on this call, environmental, social and governance metrics, they help you choose more resilient companies. They help you choose higher quality companies. And, that is an important part of the investment process.
Yeah. I think part of how this plays out will depend on how the financial costs and the economic costs that are now being visited on Russia play out amongst the Russian population and also the elite that are at the base of Putin's power base, really. So and measures to target the oligarchs, I think, are very interesting. But I was reading some history about Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, who tried to invade Ukraine and was unsuccessful. So we perhaps hope that Vladimir the Terrible won't be successful either. Let's take some questions. A question. Thanks, Sebastian. Is Russian invasion the only issue of its kind? And should we be drawing equivalents with other invasions and international aggression? And the question was, might that include the United States and Saudi Arabia, for example, with regard to Yemen? Not to mention the America's Cup. Anyone want to take that?
Look, I'm happy to try and answer it. I suppose what we're trying to do is avoid the worst, in a sense. So, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, no investment there. If we only went for the very, very, very best, we'd just be in Scandinavia probably. And so we've got to strike a balance. The US is a democracy. It has massive challenges. We've seen what's been going on there lately. It's awful to watch, but still rated as a democratic country. It's on our investable list.
Okay, David.
Yeah, it's all about where you start trying to draw a line. And as John's right, if you go too far, you don't have much of a universe left to have a look at, which is a sad indictment in itself. And it's a moving feast. But I think what's happened over the last few weeks has definitely enabled that line to be pushed out a lot further than it has been to date.
Yeah. Actually, can I just add to that, Barry? If we talk about sectors, we're not invested in any weapons companies, and I believe democracies should be able to defend themselves. So I believe in defensive weapons. But with weapons manufacturers, we can't distinguish between a weapon being used offensively, so manufactured in the US and used somewhere on the other side of the world offensively, or used defensively. And so we just don't invest in weapons as our way of dealing with it, rather than not investing in the US.
Yeah, and there is a very active flow of weapons from military hands to so-called terrorist hands. So, Tanya.
Yeah, I just agree with John and David on that score. I guess it is very hard to draw a line in the sand sometimes, but I think this one is a very easy one to draw.
Yeah, we have been doing some research on companies complicit with the regime in Myanmar and the oppression of people there, and we've been surprised by how many New Zealand funds were invested in some of those companies. So that will be the subject of a future report. We've Sebastian's also asked for some research on divestment. Be pleased to talk with you about that, Sebastian. Would love you to do some of that research done at Otago. Would certainly value an academic perspective on it, but I'll send you some papers. A question from Andrew Jenkins. Thank you, Andrew. The inclusion of Russian companies not seemingly linked to the Putin regime in Mindful Money's list surprised him. And would we be able to explain why it's important? I'll just say a word about that and then pass it particularly to you investment guys. We constructed the list partly from a published list of companies that were deemed to be linked to the Putin regime. We noted that just 3 of those major companies contributed $60 billion to the Putin regime through taxes, royalties, and other forms of financing over the past 3 years. So their influence is significant, and I think a lot of analyses would say that there's not a clear line between government and corporations, as you would find in some other countries, but actually a very close web of support for the Putin regime from the major companies and the major oligarchs in Russia. So that's why we included those companies. We're a little surprised when the New Zealand Super Fund announced that it was excluding companies. It just excluded the state-owned companies, and I think that it doesn't necessarily take account of some of those links in countries like Russia. And I know that Super Fund will be doing research on where those, on excluding those where those links can be shown. John, David, do you have any comments on that, on how to tease out kind of who's part of a supportive structure for a regime like the Russian government?
Yeah, look, I think you explained it well, Barry, and the help to the government can be from banks. It can be from technology companies, technology companies helping develop AI, for example. I've seen one fund that invests on an ESG basis. They had one holding in Russia that was a search engine over there, so like a Google equivalent. And they saw it as a really good, high on an S factor, social factor, because it was helping Russians find information. But they ended up selling it and getting out because they understood it was helping rather than hindering the progress of the country at the moment, given the troubles. And it does hurt citizens. A lot of citizens don't support what's going on, and it will hurt them. But we've just got to put as much pressure on as we can.
Yeah, you're right. I think it'd be somewhat naive to think that there are Russian companies operating in Russia completely independent of that regime.
Yeah.
And even if it doesn't appear to be the case, something going on behind the scenes that means, unfortunately, you're better to send the right message collectively and just removing everything.
Yeah. We might take one last question because we're running out of time. Thanks for the questions. This one is, are companies divested? I think it's a really good question, and it's a useful challenge to us all. Are companies divesting from Russia for moral reasons? Or is it because sanctions and Russia's removal from the SWIFT system are making it too difficult for companies to do business? I think that's quite a challenge. Tanya, do you want to kick off on that? Is it your impression that you see particularly companies and maybe fund managers moving on this stuff? Are they doing it because of financial reasons, because they're worried about prices going down, or are they doing it because they actually care about not having their money in the Russian government at a time of Russian aggression?
Yeah, I wouldn't presume to know, but I would hope that they are withdrawing for moral reasons. I don't think anyone can watch all those mums and children getting on the trains and leaving the dads behind to fight and actually not take a moral stance on that one. So I would hope it's for moral reasons more than anything else. There is obviously going to be trouble trying to sell or do anything with investments, while everyone's divesting, but you would hope that it would be moral reasons to remove yourself from that situation and just make a stand and say, I'm not okay with this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
it's absolutely a moral issue, and price is very secondary. It's almost polar opposites, because there are people who operate in the investment world who specialize in buying distressed securities, and they are the ones who are going to have the massive issue to have to try and balance out morals with financial assets, because they'll be able to pick up Russian securities at sort of 5 cents in the dollar and that's the decision making they're going to have to come up with. And I can assure you that that's not a decision space that we're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Barry, I'd just add, I think there's one more reason as well. I mean, I'd like to think the corporates that are, the large accounting firms, the large law firms, McDonald's, that are closing or severing ties completely with Russia are doing it for purely moral reasons. They want to be on the right side of history. I think the late adopters will be doing it because the reputation risk to their business. This is a watershed moment we've talked about, and I think it'll be for multinationals to not take a stand on it. They will lose mana. It will damage their reputation. I think the people doing it now are doing it for absolutely values-based reasons, but people may also do it for reputation reasons down the track.
I think that's one. I agree. I think it's one thing that's really changed in recent years is that companies are much more attuned to that intersection of moral reasons and their reputational value. That actually they kind of get it if they're on the wrong moral side of an issue, their reputation is going to suffer. So I'm not sure it's quite so possible to unpick what's financial and what's a moral reason, because actually the two are now fairly closely connected. And for a company, if they lose reputation, that's typically their most valuable asset. And doing the right thing is typically also a good financial decision. So thank you all very much, and thank you very much to our audience. I'm sure we will all conclude with saying this has been about finance, but hopefully it's also been about kind of ways that New Zealand people can support those in Ukraine that are suffering from the invasion, and kind of our hearts are with them. And I guess, we're sort of motivated by anything that we can do to help out in this situation is a small token of what we can do. And the fact that it's happening worldwide, I think, is an amazing sign that people are waking up to our interconnectedness globally, and so hopefully it's going to make a big difference to I guess limit the suffering and hopefully restore some peace to Ukraine soon. So thank you to our panel, and thanks also to the very generous sponsors for this series. AMP, Booster, Generate KiwiSaver, Harbour Asset Management, and PwC. And a special thank you to you and our audience. We're not on next week. We will be back in a fortnight's time. Please visit our website to register for the seminar series, and we'll see you online then. Manakitanga kia koutou ka kite anō.
Ngā mihi.